what is a Paleo-Confederate, and what is your view of Southern slavery?
Okay. Boy, I've been wishing that somebody would ask me this question. I'm glad this finally came up. Paleo-Confederate was a phrase that I used or appropriated to distinguish myself from NeoConfederate, right? A NeoConfederate is, in the common parlance, is someone who is still fighting the war, who wants a, and by the war I mean the late unpleasantness, the War of 1861 to 1865.
He wants the South to rise again.
Yeah. So, but for a neo-Confederate, if you refer to the war, there's only one.
Right.
There's only one war. So neo-Confederates want to redo. They want to do over at Gettysburg. They want to continue the same fight, and politically they can't continue the same fight. History matters. We're downstream from that point. So I use the phrase Paleo-Confederate to not surrender the principles that were involved in that fight, while recognizing that defending those principles in a modern context is going to look different. We're going to be in the terrain has changed, the circumstances have changed. So a Paleo-Confederate is not someone who is simply a diehard, and in the neo-Confederate parlance, there's sort of a person who is he's going to go down fighting, and he's going to be part of the Army of Northern Virginia when he goes down, which is different than a Paleo-Confederate who says, look, the South had a point on the constitutional matters surrounding the war. The Constitution meant something, and historically something shifted in American polity as a result of that war, and we're having to navigate the consequences of that shift, and we should be honest with ourselves about how it happened, right? So a Paleo-Confederate says, look, I think that Lincoln was a centralizer. I think that the post-war amendments to the Constitution inverted the meaning of the Constitution. Before the war, the Constitution placed restrictions on the power of the federal government. After the war, those amendments became means by which the federal government suppressed the power of the states. There was a fundamental shift that was brought about by that war, and nothing is advanced if we tell ourselves stories about if we deny that happened.
Right. And then the second part of that is, what's your view of Southern slavery?
Okay, here's the. Let me go back and say a little bit about why these questions are being posed to me. Is in the mid-'90s, I co-authored a little booklet called Southern Slavery as It Was with Steve Wilkins. And this is what was going on at that time. In the mid-'90s, if you recall, a fellow named Paul Hill was a fellow who shot and killed an abortionist in Florida. And Paul Hill was a Reformed Christian. He was a classmate of Steve Wilkins at RTS in Jackson. Steve, my friend, had spent hours with him on the phone before this happened, trying to talk him off the roof of his radicalism. And Paul Hill wanted to become the pro-lifer's John Brown.
Right.
And he wanted the shooting of this abortionist to be Harper's Ferry, and and this was also the same approximate time where you had Operation Rescues going on around the country. We were at the time, it seemed, from in the middle of that, it seemed like we were teetering on the brink of some sort of serious societal chaos. So we published that booklet in part to say to Paul Hill and people like him, you were taught in school that John Brown was a prophet and a seer and a visionary, He was actually a bloodthirsty thug, and he was trying to solve a problem, the problem of slavery, in exactly the way the New Testament says not to solve that kind of problem. So, and this is what dawned on me one time. I've been pro-life from, before Roe v. Wade. There was a court decision where New York State liberalized their abortion legislation and their abortion laws. I remember being very agitated by that. I've been pro-life from almost to the point of becoming an adult, and I used to glibly just say, well, Supreme Court abortion, Supreme Court Dred Scott, it's all the same. Everything's the same. And then one day it dawned on me, reading the New Testament, that the Bible, the New Testament, talks an awful lot about how to handle a social problem of slavery when you have masters who are slave owners, Christians who are slave owners, and Christians who are slaves themselves, all in the same church. You've got Philemon and Onesimus. And when Paul tackles the problem of slavery in Philemon, his solution is not for Onesimus to chop off Philemon's head and march around with his head on a pike.
Right.
Right. His solution is to remember, Philemon, you remember you've got a master in heaven. Treat your slaves equitably, as he argues in Ephesians. And Timothy says, you slaves, if you have believing masters, work doubly hard for them. Don't, in other words, there's a real subversiveness there, aimed at the institution of slavery, but it is not the John Brown violent revolution approach.
So what's the difference then between, say, the abolitionist spirit that was in America in the 19th century, and then, say, the way slavery ended in England?
Well, see, that's the whole point. The abolitionist, the person who wants bloodshed, slavery ended and good riddance. This is the important part. Slavery ended in the West and good riddance in the Western world. Everywhere else, peaceably. Here, we killed 600,000 people in order to do it, and established a pattern of racial animosities that lasted, well over a century. And that came from disobeying how the Bible said to do it. So the problem is not wanting to labor for the elimination of slavery. Prior to the war, 5/7 of all the anti-slavery societies that existed were in the South. Southerners knew they had a problem, and this is not a long-term tenable situation. Obviously not. Clearly, obviously not. The question is whether you kill boatloads of people to solve it, and I don't think we ought to have done that. And I think we departed from the Pauline way of addressing social problems and opted for the revolutionary way. So when I reject the revolutionary way, many people think that I am arguing for ongoing slavery as a positive good, like food, air, and sunshine.
Right.
No, I object to the debt slavery that is so common in our society now. What the banks are doing to people and mortgaging our futures and a real tangible financial debt slavery. I object to that debt slavery, but I don't believe that we ought to storm the banks and execute the managers.
Right.
Not revolution, but we have to do something. In the same way, Christians, I'd recommend a real good book on Mark Knoll wrote a book called The Civil Wars, The Theological Crisis, which is very good, and Eugene Genovese wrote A Consuming Fire. And both those books taken together show that this was a screaming social, religious, ethical problem which cannot be solved by armies. That's the point. But to say that armies can't solve it is not to say that you're denying that there's a problem. No, there's very clearly a problem, particularly the racial basis for slavery. So I've pointed out in the New Testament that there were slaves and masters in the same congregations in the New Testament. But, and this is important to point out to Southern, and so that would chafe the abolitionist when I point out the Bible says that. But if I wanted to chafe a racist Southerner, I'd point out that all the slaves in the New Testament were white.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
They're white slaves. And could a white man be a slave in the South? You know,
Right.
no. And why not? Doesn't the New Testament allow for slavery?
Right.
Well, there was a racial component in there that's alien to the Greco-Roman situation.